"This isn't a real one," Maid's daughter whispered in perfect German, saved Billionaire from a scam. The crystal chandeliers of Pendleton Hall glittered over a sea of diamonds, champagne, and polite deceit. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a billionaire's redemption after years of grief. Arthur Pendleton, 65, stood at the center of it all, tall, silver-haired, immaculate in his black tuxedo. His guests watched as he lifted the hand of his fiancée, Isabella Rossi, the stunning art consultant half his age. On her finger blazed a diamond ring said to have belonged to European royalty, a stone worth more than most men's fortunes. "May love," Arthur declared, voice trembling, "make the years I lost feel short again." Polite applause followed. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and then a whisper. Soft, hesitant, and perfectly spoken in German. "This ring isn't real." The sound sliced through the music like a blade. Arthur froze. He hadn't heard German since his late wife Eleanor died 5 years earlier. Slowly, he turned. Standing by the buffet was a small girl with chestnut hair and wide, thoughtful eyes. Clara Vance, 10 years old, daughter of Helen, his longtime housekeeper. The room stilled. "What did you say, child?" Arthur asked, his tone gentler than expected. Clara blinked, frightened but firm. "I said, 'The diamond isn't real, sir. It's shouting too much.'" Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous, dismissive. Isabella forced a smile, tightening her grip on Arthur's arm. "How adorable," she cooed. "A future gemologist, perhaps." But Arthur didn't smile. The words echoed in his mind. Shouting too much. A phrase Eleanor had once used when judging imitation jewels. Only someone who truly understood light would say it that way. His heart pounded. The music resumed, but he couldn't hear it. He looked again at the child, then at the ring, and for the first time that night, the sparkle on Isabella's finger seemed to glare rather than glow. Around him, guests resumed their chatter, oblivious, but Arthur Pendleton, once the shrewdest mind in finance, felt the first cold tremor of doubt slide through his veins. Had he, the man who built empires, just been fooled by a glittering lie? By morning, Pendleton Hall returned to its practiced stillness, the stillness of money well arranged. The East Wing woke first. Sunlight draped itself across a row of maritime paintings, the kind Eleanor had loved. Frigates under bruised skies, gulls stitched in white over a pewter sea. House staff moved like a quiet tide through the corridors, polishing absence until it shone. Arthur Pendleton walked those halls the way a man walks through a museum of his own life, hands behind his back, gaze steady, heart elsewhere. At 65, he was still imposing, tall, tempered, the silver in his hair worn like a medal. Success clung to him even in silence. Board seats, private foundations, a constellation of companies whose quarterly reports could shake smaller economies. And yet, in his eyes, there lay the frank fatigue of a widower who had learned the exact weight of 5 lonely years. He paused at Eleanor's favorite canvas, Storm over Doggerbank, and felt the familiar ache. They used to speak German together when they wanted privacy in crowds, a habit from their graduate days in Munich. After her death, the language went with her, filed away with winter coats and string quartets, until last night when a child's whisper had picked the lock. "This ring isn't real. It's shouting too much." Arthur hadn't told anyone that shouting was Eleanor's word for counterfeit sparkle, stones that sprayed light on the surface but drank none of it. Real gems, she'd say, kept aflame, quiet, deep, convincing. Downstairs, breakfast clattered in the servants' hallway. Helen Vance, housekeeper for more than a decade, moved with a competence that made the grand machine of the estate look effortless. Vendors confirmed, deliveries checked, fresh flowers set in the blue Imari vase by the stairs because Mr. Pendleton notices first blooms. Helen was the kind of presence money hoped to buy. Steady, discreet, incorruptible, but never could. She had learned that cadence from her father, Sergeant Michael Vance, who'd served on the Allied Monuments Men detail, reclaiming stolen art across a shredded Europe. He'd taught her how truth hides in brushstrokes and alloys the way it hides in people. Clara drifted behind her mother like a thought. 10 years old, alert, the kind of quiet that sees everything. She carried a dog-eared notebook and a stub pencil. When the house slept, she catalogued small secrets. The way morning light traveled along the banister, which paintings were slightly off plumb, how gilt frames gathered dust no feather duster could catch. Her world was pattern. Her game was difference. In the Vance household, seeing counted as a virtue. The world of Isabella Rossi glittered louder. She arrived at Pendleton Hall 6 months earlier with a portfolio of museum friends, auction successes, and a smile that could pass any guard. She knew how to talk to money without sounding like she wanted it. She knew how to tilt her head so generosity felt like romance. She said modernity was ethical curation, favored foundation galas, where philanthropy met cameras, and insisted that beauty should perform. When she stood beneath the chandeliers, she fit the light as if it had been rehearsed. Isabella had opinions on everything: conservation protocol, shipping crates, champagne. She guided Arthur through strategic divestments of a few minor impressionists. "We'll put that capital to work in undervalued maritime pieces, your story, Arthur," and introduced a private jeweler to evaluate the Pendleton stones in line with current provenance standards. It sounded like stewardship. It felt like control. The staff, who could read temperature by footfalls, learned her entrances quickly. She kept the kitchen amused with pronunciation corrections, the gardeners puzzled with seasonal demands, and the security firm busy installing a smart cataloging system no one had asked for. When Isabella smiled at Helen, it was always 1 degree too bright. When she glanced at Clara, she looked through her, as if children were reflections, not bodies. Arthur did not live blindly. He knew influence when it leaned on him. But grief is a practiced counterfeiter. It learns your former joys and reproduces them just well enough to pass. Isabella arrived with attention at precisely the hour his loneliness wanted to be chosen. She asked about Eleanor with the restraint of a trained interviewer and spoke of the sea as an instrument for memory, phrases that sounded like understanding. When she slipped German phrases into conversation, they landed a hair off key. Arthur chalked it up to performance nerves. He forgave the pitch because she seemed to be trying. And yet, since last night, a splinter of doubt had lodged in the quiet part of him. A child's whisper had aligned too perfectly with the buried vocabulary of his marriage. He had seen 1,000 deals implode for want of a small question. Now a small question stared back from Isabella's finger. He rang for Helen. "I'll need Samuel Finch this afternoon," Arthur said, naming the family's jeweler of record for 3 decades. "Unannounced, and only through the south gate, please." "Yes, sir," Helen replied, the flicker of surprise hidden before it reached her face. "And Helen, your daughter, she speaks German?" Helen hesitated only a heartbeat. "My father taught us both some, sir. Clara has a gift for language, and for noticing." Arthur nodded toward Eleanor's painting. "That line about a stone shouting, did you teach her that?" "No, sir," Helen said. "My father did. He used to say a true diamond drinks light and returns it like a kept promise. Paste reflects like clatter." Arthur's mouth tightened. Recognition, grief, and something like relief threading together. He dismissed her gently and walked on. The social ladder within Pendleton Hall was as old as the columns. Donors and directors, then curators and consultants, and somewhere under all that polish, the people who made the coffee hot and the floors shine. Arthur had learned to hear truth up and down that ladder. He'd made his first fortune because a freight supervisor in Rotterdam told him a shipment's sound wasn't right. He sold an overvalued telecom on the word of a switchboard operator who heard silence where there should have been chatter. He believed in instruments, but he trusted instruments made of human habit more. Which is why he noticed, this morning, what Isabella didn't do. She didn't ask about the German. She didn't mention Clara. She filled the air with futures, the engagement party redo. Smaller, more intimate, the optics will be tasteful. A curated press piece. You deserve a narrative of renewal and a responsible reappraisal of the family jewels to protect your philanthropic brand. Brand, Arthur repeated mildly, watching her watch herself in a gilt mirror. Isabella drifted to the maritime wall, wrapped herself in the vocabulary of provenance, and misnamed a frigate a brig without hearing the error. Energy, she said of the storm painting. It performs resilience. Eleanor would have laughed, or winced. She had taught Arthur that the sea didn't perform. It endured. At noon, the Bentley eased through the south gate with Samuel Finch in the back. His old leather case the same one he'd carried into Pendleton Hall since the Reagan years. Sam was a man who had more loops than jokes, and more discretion than most vaults. Arthur greeted him alone in the small library, the one room Isabella had not yet remade. Shelves of ship logs and tide charts lined the walls. The air smelled like paper and salt. Unmounted inspection, Arthur said softly, handing over the ring. Sam's brows rose almost imperceptibly. Congratulations are in order, then. Let's postpone the toasts. They worked without ceremony. White cloth, cool lamplight, loop. Sam hummed once, the way mechanics hum at a good engine just before admitting the sound is off. He adjusted the light angle, then the loop, then the light again. He tested heat, examined girdle, sought the small betrayals stones cannot help making. It's beautiful, Sam said at last, which in jeweler meant not what you paid for. Brilliantly cut, very clean, and not a diamond. Arthur let the silence accept the words, so the room could keep them. Moissanite, Sam added gently. A good one. High silicon labstone can fool a man who wants to be fooled. Fire for days. Too much fire, in fact. Shouting, Arthur said, almost to himself. Sam glanced up. Yes, shouting. From the corridor came the faintest rustle, the sound of a child standing perfectly still. Arthur did not turn. He didn't need to. Some truths you honor by not breaking the way they arrive. Social gravity inside Pendleton Hall would shift before the day closed. For now, Arthur studied the stone that promised too loudly and returned it to its box. He thought of the girl who had used his wife's word as if she'd borrowed it kindly from the past and returned it clean. Upstairs, Isabella arranged a bouquet and her expression in the same mirror, practicing sincerity. Downstairs, Helen added a line to the household ledger. Samuel Finch, arrived 12:03, departed 12:41. In the service corridor, Clara traced 3 words into the margin of her notebook and underlined them twice. Drinks, keeps, quiet. Arthur closed the lid on the ring, and with it, the season of pretending. The world of excess he wore like a second skin still fit. It simply no longer felt like him. Somewhere between a whisper in German and a jeweler's hum, the balance of power had tilted, away from chandeliers and toward daylight. When he stepped back into the hall, he did not look at the portraits for approval. He looked for truth, in the varnish, in the voices, in the small human seams, where deception always frays first. And for the first time in years, he felt less alone in the work of telling real from counterfeit. A child had joined the team. The afternoon light slanted across the ballroom floor like a verdict. Arthur stood near the tall windows, the ring box in his hand, its weight absurdly small for what it carried, the undoing of trust, of pride, of an old man's hope. Across the room, Isabella Rossi was directing florists. She moved like a stage actress in the final act of a performance, voice bright, gestures flawless. Hydrangeas for the entrance, yes? They soften the marble beautifully. Her Italian accent rolled off the tongue like practiced music. She didn't see Arthur at first, or maybe she pretended not to. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost kind. "You chose this stone yourself, didn't you?" Isabella turned, smiling as if it were a compliment. "Of course. The jeweler I use in Milan is extraordinary. They've handled pieces for European royalty." "Royalty?" Arthur repeated softly. "And this ring belonged to them?" "That's what the provenance states, yes. I even showed you the certificate." He nodded, setting the small velvet box on the nearest table. "You did, but I had it examined." Something flickered in her eyes, too fast for most to notice, but not for him. He had negotiated with men who could mask fear behind charm. He knew the exact second the lie stiffens. Arthur opened the box. The stone inside winked innocently beneath the chandelier. "It's moissanite," he said. "Synthetic silicon carbide, lab-grown, flawless in the wrong ways." A faint gasp echoed from the florist nearest the door. Isabella's smile didn't falter, but her voice thinned. "That's absurd. Perhaps Finch is mistaken." "Finch," Arthur interrupted, "has been appraising my family's jewels since before you learned to spell authenticity." Her face hardened. "Arthur, I don't appreciate—" He raised a hand, calm but final. "Don't. Not another performance." For a long moment, silence pooled between them. Even the staff had stopped moving. The scent of cut flowers hung heavy in the still air. Arthur's words came quieter now, but sharper. "Do you know who noticed it first?" Isabella blinked. "A child," he said. "Helen's daughter. She spoke to me in German, Eleanor's language. She said, 'The stone shouts too loudly.' My wife used to say the same thing about fakes. You didn't even know that word, did you, Isabella? Shouting." Her eyes flickered. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wasn't used to silence working against her. Arthur took a breath. "Tell me, what did you want? The money? The house? Or just the thrill of conquering a lonely man?" Isabella's mask cracked. The warmth drained from her face, leaving something harder, sharper. "You think you're difficult to fool, Arthur, but you're the easiest kind of man. You collect people like you collect paintings, because they make the walls less empty. I just gave you the illusion of color." He stared at her, the ache in his chest twisting into clarity. "You gave me noise," he said, "and for a while I mistook it for music." When he turned away, she reached for his arm, her tone shifting again, pleading now, rehearsed sincerity trembling on cue. "Arthur, please, listen. We can fix this. It was a misunderstanding. You know how much I love—" He stopped her with a look. It wasn't anger that silenced her. It was recognition. The kind of gaze that sees through a person's last disguise and finds nothing behind it. "Love," he said quietly. "You really should learn what that word means before using it as a key." He picked up the ring box and closed it with a soft click that sounded louder than thunder. Then he turned to the staff. "The engagement party is cancelled. Miss Rossi will be leaving the property today. Nothing from this house goes with her." Isabella's breath hitched. "You can't just—" "Oh, I can," Arthur said. "It's my house, my name, my mistake." Two guards from the private security detail entered, uncertain but ready. Isabella's expression contorted, cycling through disbelief, fury, and finally calculation. "You'll regret this. You'll look ridiculous when the press hears you were duped by a maid's daughter." Arthur didn't flinch. "No," he said. "They'll hear that a maid's daughter saw truth before a billionaire did, and maybe that's the story the world needs." Her heels struck the marble like gunshots as she left, trailed by silence. When the doors closed behind her, Arthur felt no triumph, only the weight of 5 years settling at last. The ballroom still glimmered, but every crystal, every candle, seemed to hum with the same false light as the ring. Helen appeared quietly at the threshold, Clara hiding just behind her skirt. "Sir," Helen began, "I'm so sorry if she—" Arthur shook his head. "No, Helen, she saved me." He crouched down to meet Clara's eyes. "You saw what I couldn't. Thank you." The girl blushed, twisting her hands. "It just didn't look right, sir. It was too bright." Arthur smiled faintly. "Yes, too bright." He rose, turning toward the window where the afternoon sun bled gold across the floor. Sometimes the real things whisper, the fakes, they shout. Outside, the first storm clouds gathered over the estate, dimming the glittering chandeliers. Inside, for the first time in years, Arthur Pendleton stood beneath quiet light, painful, honest, and clean. After the confrontation, Arthur withdrew to his private study, the only room in Pendleton Hall that still belonged entirely to the past. The others had been polished and remade under Isabella's curatorial touch, but this one remained untouched. Heavy books, dust-soft carpets, and Eleanor's favorite scent of sandalwood still lingering in the air. The rain had begun to fall, slow and deliberate, as if the sky understood restraint better than he had. Arthur set the velvet ring box on the desk beside a sepia photograph of Eleanor, her dark hair pinned in that effortless way, her eyes bright with the same intelligence that could stop him mid-sentence. In the photo, she was laughing at something he'd said. He couldn't remember what anymore. He stared at the ring for a long time. How strange that something so small could contain so many mistakes. A phrase of hers echoed in his mind. "Don't chase light, Arthur. Let it come to you." He'd first met Eleanor Schaefer 40 years earlier at a symposium in Munich. He, the ambitious young financier trying to impress investors with his multilingual charm. She, the art historian who saw through him in 5 minutes flat. "You talk like a man trying to fill silence with proof," she'd said, amused. "And you talk like a woman who isn't impressed by numbers," he'd replied. "Correct," she'd said, smiling. "Numbers only measure what's visible. I care about what's not." That night, she'd dragged him to a small gallery off Leopoldstrasse, where a local painter was showing works of light and shadow. Nothing commercial, nothing perfect. She'd stood in front of a dull, unfinished canvas and whispered, "Do you see? The light isn't painted on. It's buried underneath." He hadn't, not then, but he'd spent the rest of his life trying to. They married 2 years later, and for 3 decades Eleanor became his compass. She taught him how to look deeper, at art, at business, at people. When he built his first company, she warned him, "Never mistake confidence for clarity. The loudest room is often the least honest." She was right more times than he liked to admit. He'd made millions listening to her intuition. When to buy, when to sell, when to walk away. Their private code evolved over the years, a lexicon of quiet truth. When she said a person was reflecting, she meant they were pretending. When she said something shouted, it meant it lacked soul. "That word again," shouted. He smiled faintly. Eleanor had hated over-polished diamonds, preferring flawed stones with heart. "Imperfection," she'd once told him, "is just authenticity refusing to disguise itself." When she died, the house dimmed. Not just emotionally, literally. He'd replaced chandeliers, added lamps, but the light never behaved the same way. It was too sharp, too white, too obedient. Eleanor's absence had stolen the flame from everything that sparkled. For years afterward, Arthur lived in quiet order. He filled the house with consultants and curators, people who spoke of provenance and aesthetic value. Their words were sterile, mechanical. He mistook that precision for stability. And then Isabella Rossi arrived, all color and warmth, a whirlwind of praise and energy. She had Eleanor's hair color, Eleanor's way of standing slightly off-center when listening. Her accent, her eyes, enough resemblance to tug at something fragile in him. When she spoke about bringing life back into the house, he believed her because he wanted to. He'd forgotten Eleanor's first warning. The loudest room is often the least honest. The betrayal stung not because of money or reputation, but because it mocked the lessons that once defined him. He had spent a lifetime learning to discern truth from performance, and still, grief had made him gullible. He poured himself a small glass of scotch, staring at the rain against the windows. Outside, the world blurred into streaks of grey and silver. He thought of Eleanor's laughter, her soft German murmurs when correcting his pronunciation. When Clara had whispered in that same language, so pure, so unforced, it had pierced him straight through the armor of years. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. The inflection had been identical to Eleanor's when she was amused by a forgery. Perhaps that's why he listened, not to the words, but to the echo of the woman who taught him what truth sounds like. He took the ring out again and turned it under the lamp. The gem blazed furiously, shooting light in every direction, a performance of brilliance. Eleanor would have called it desperate. He could almost hear her chuckle. "See? It's not drinking light, Arthur. It's spitting it back." He smiled through the ache. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the moors. He thought of Helen and her father, that war veteran who'd rescued stolen art and unmasked fakes when nations couldn't. There was honor in that kind of seeing, not judgment, but care. Clara carried that gift, innocent and sharp as glass. He found himself imagining what Eleanor would have said about her. She would have knelt to Clara's height, studied her eyes, and said, "You notice what others miss. Never let the world shame you for that." The clock chimed once, low and resonant. Arthur rose and placed the fake ring beside Eleanor's photograph. "I should have known," he murmured. "You always said grief makes fools of clever men." He ran a hand through his hair, straightened his jacket, and exhaled. The pain didn't fade, but it sharpened, became purpose. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt something like momentum again. The time for silence had ended. By morning, the tabloids would spin the engagement scandal into gossip. But beneath the noise, Arthur Pendleton had begun to wake. The part of him Eleanor had trained for truth was alive again. He turned off the lamp. The fake diamond still glimmered in the dark, too bright for its own good. Arthur smiled faintly. "Shout all you want," he whispered to it. "I've learned to listen for quiet." By dawn, the story had already escaped the walls of Pendleton Hall. Headlines bloomed like weeds across digital news feeds. Billionaire's fiancé exposed as fraud. Arthur Pendleton's engagement crumbles over fake diamond. Servant's daughter unmasks high society con. Arthur's PR team panicked, his board members whispered, and society, ever hungry for a downfall, feasted on the spectacle. They called him naive, desperate, a fool blinded by loneliness. He let them. For 48 hours, he said nothing. He didn't issue a statement, didn't call a lawyer, didn't try to spin the narrative. The silence unsettled people more than any defense could. On the third day, when journalists swarmed the gates, Arthur finally appeared. He didn't wear a tailored suit or his usual air of unshakable authority. Just a dark coat, his silver hair uncombed by intent, his expression clear. Helen and Clara stood discreetly behind him, the child clutching a small notebook. Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Pendleton, were you aware the ring was fake? Is it true your housekeeper's daughter discovered the fraud? Do you plan to press charges against Miss Rossi?" Arthur lifted a hand, not commanding, just enough to earn silence. "Yes," he said, voice steady, measured. "The ring was fake, the engagement was fake, but the truth that uncovered it was real." The crowd stilled, sensing a different kind of headline forming. "It wasn't a private investigator or a banker who saved me," Arthur continued. "It was a child, a 10-year-old girl who noticed what I couldn't. Because while the rest of us were looking for brilliance, she was looking for honesty." He turned slightly, meeting Clara's eyes. Sometimes it takes innocence to see what experience has forgotten. Clara looked down, embarrassed, but Helen's eyes glistened with quiet pride. Arthur faced the cameras again. This house, my company, my fortune, they've all been built on the premise of value. But somewhere along the way, I confused value with vanity. I surrounded myself with reflections, people, things, promises that shouted for attention, and I mistook their noise for meaning. He paused, letting the words settle like dust in still air. I will not hide behind lawyers or apologies. Ms. Rossi's deceit is hers to answer for. Mine was believing that wealth can substitute for wisdom. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one expected humility. Arthur continued, his tone firm now. Pendleton Hall will change. Effective immediately, I'm launching a foundation in Eleanor's name to teach art authentication and ethical restoration. And the first appointment, he gestured toward Helen and Clara, goes to the family who reminded me that truth still matters. Reporters clamored for more, but Arthur turned away, ending the conference on his own terms. He had no interest in repairing image. He was rebuilding integrity. Inside, Helen tried to speak, but Arthur raised a hand gently. No thanks needed. You two brought this house back to life. He looked down at Clara, who was studying the ornate banister with the same curiosity that had once saved him. You know, Clara, he said, you might have just ruined high society's favorite illusion. She frowned slightly. Which one, sir? That the rich are the best at telling what's real. For the first time in years, Arthur Pendleton laughed, a sound deep, rough, but genuine. Outside, the cameras kept flashing, but the story had already changed direction. The fallen billionaire was no longer a punchline. He was the man who had listened to a whisper and turned it into truth. In the weeks following the press conference, the world of Arthur Pendleton watched in disbelief. The man who had once defined wealth by silence and distance was suddenly everywhere, calm, articulate, and sharper than he'd ever been. He attended no galas, gave no interviews about image repair. Instead, he spoke only about truth, about preservation, about the quiet courage it takes to look closely. Behind the scenes, however, a storm of intelligence and precision was unfolding. Arthur had not built an empire by trusting easily. When he discovered the fake ring, he also began tracing the hands it had passed through. Every transaction, every receipt, every discreet introduction Isabella had made was a string, and Arthur knew how to pull strings until knots unraveled. He worked out of his late wife's study, the door always open. Helen often found him at the old mahogany desk, papers spread like chess pieces, the faint hum of classical music filling the room. And always nearby, Clara, perched quietly on a chair, sketching patterns from the family's art collection or reading her grandfather's old notebook on forgery detection. What do you see there? Arthur asked one evening, nodding toward a sketch she was finishing. The brush strokes on this ship, Clara said, pointing. They don't move with the water. They're fighting it. I think it's been repainted. Arthur smiled. That's what we're doing now, Clara. Repainting truth where someone tried to forge it. With the help of a private investigator and his legal counsel, Arthur discovered that Isabella's art advisory network was a shell, a pipeline for laundering stolen or counterfeit art through wealthy collectors too proud to question provenance. The fake ring had been just one of many entries in a long ledger of deceit, each crafted to look almost right, designed to be bought by men who didn't like being told they were wrong. Arthur's public response was masterful. He didn't shout, sue, or threaten. Instead, he hosted a closed exhibition at Pendleton Hall called The Quiet Eye, What Truth Looks Like. Only 30 guests were invited: museum curators, ethical art dealers, historians, and journalists with reputations for integrity. The grand ballroom, once the stage of his humiliation, was transformed into a gallery of contrast. One side filled with authentic Pendleton pieces, the other with flawless forgeries Isabella's team had sold him. No signs labeled them, no guards directed. Only light, soft, honest sunlight from the glass dome above. As guests entered, they whispered, unsure what to expect. Arthur stood at the center, wearing a simple gray suit. Beside him, Helen handled introductions, while Clara adjusted a small lamp to illuminate the centerpiece, the fake engagement ring. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice measured, confident. "Tonight's exhibition isn't about wealth. It's about the cost of blindness." He gestured to the walls. "Half of what you see here is real. Half is not. The difference cannot be measured by appraisers or insurance. It's seen only by those willing to look without wanting." He let the silence breathe. Then, in a soft smile, "The smallest truth in this room belongs to the smallest person in it." Clara flushed as heads turned toward her. "This young lady," Arthur continued, "saw in seconds what I, armed with experience, advisors, and pride, could not. She reminded me of something my late wife taught me long ago. That authenticity isn't about perfection. It's about patience." He paused, lifting the fake diamond from its box. Under the natural light it blazed too brightly, scattering colors like fireworks. Real diamonds drink light. Fakes scream for it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Museum directors leaned closer, some embarrassed by their own uncertainty. "Ms. Rossi," Arthur went on, "used knowledge not to enlighten but to deceive. She built illusions so polished that even experts applauded them. But the truth," he said, lowering his hand, "doesn't need applause. It stands quietly." In the back of the room, one of the journalists, an art correspondent for The Guardian, raised her voice. "Mr. Pendleton, what will happen to Isabella Rossi?" Arthur's answer was almost gentle. "Justice will handle her. My concern is education, not revenge." The next morning, his team released evidence of Isabella's network to the authorities, prompting international investigations. Her name, once adored in art circles, became synonymous with fraud. But the real victory wasn't in her downfall. It was in what rose afterward. Within a month, Arthur launched the Pendleton Foundation for Ethical Art and Design, housed in a converted wing of his estate. He appointed Helen as director of operations, overseeing everything from logistics to preservation outreach. And Clara, though only 10, was given an honorary title she took far too seriously, Chief Truth Consultant. Every morning before lessons, she joined Arthur in the gallery. Together they catalogued paintings, traced signatures, studied light. Arthur taught her how to read contracts and negotiate with experts. Clara, in return, taught him how to see again. One afternoon, while inspecting a small portrait believed to be Flemish, Clara frowned. "It's wrong," she said. "The painter wouldn't use that pigment for sky." Arthur chuckled. "You're sure?" She nodded. "Positive." They sent it for analysis. She was right. "You have your mother's steadiness," Arthur told her, "and your grandfather's eyes." Helen, watching from the doorway, smiled softly. For the first time, she saw her daughter's gift treated not as precociousness, but as purpose. The transformation didn't stop there. When financial reporters tried to spin Arthur's re-emergence as a comeback, he corrected them in interviews. "It's not a comeback, it's a correction." He dismantled 2 vanity projects Isabella had started, an overfunded art tech app and a gallery expansion meant to flatter investors. Instead, he redirected the funds to scholarships for young restorers and training programs for war-torn museum regions. At his final board meeting of the quarter, one of his longtime directors leaned across the polished table. "Arthur, the press still calls you the man who lost millions to a fraud. Doesn't that sting?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Not anymore. You can't lose what was never real." The room went quiet. Even his critics couldn't argue with that. And somewhere inside him, something old, something Eleanor had planted decades ago, finally bloomed again. The quiet confidence of knowing what mattered. That night, after everyone had gone, Arthur stood in the gallery alone. The fake diamond still caught the lamplight, scattering its desperate colors across the walls. He dimmed the lights until it stopped shouting. Then he whispered, "Thank you, little one," to the empty room. Not to the ring, but to Clara. Outside, the moon rose over Pendleton Hall. Its light was soft, imperfect, and utterly real. The news broke quietly at first, a headline buried beneath political noise. Interpol confirms arrest of Isabella Rossi in Paris. But within hours, it spread like wildfire. Photos of the once celebrated art consultant being escorted from a penthouse suite flooded every channel. Her empire, built on charm and imitation, had collapsed overnight. Galleries she'd partnered with scrambled to distance themselves. Collectors demanded refunds. Her website vanished. Arthur read the headline at breakfast in the same calm way he might read the weather report. He folded the paper, set it beside his tea, and said only, "It's done." Helen looked up from the table. "You didn't have to go that far, sir." "I didn't," Arthur replied. The truth did. He spent that day as he always did now, walking the estate gardens with Clara. The air was brisk, the early autumn light soft on the hedges. Clara skipped ahead, notebook in hand, sketching leaves and jotting notes like a small detective. "Mr. Pendleton," she asked suddenly, "is Ms. Rossi going to jail forever?" Arthur slowed his steps. "No, Clara, probably not forever. The world has its own way of forgiving people who look the part." "That's not fair," she said. "No," he agreed, "but justice doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it just removes the mask." She seemed to think about that for a while, then nodded as if it made sense in her quiet way. Later that week, Arthur received a letter from Isabella's lawyer, an apology drafted but unsigned. It offered restitution, cooperation, and a plea for mercy. He read it once and placed it in a drawer beside Eleanor's photograph. He would never respond. Forgiveness didn't require an audience. The world, of course, wanted a performance. Reporters begged for comment, investors urged him to celebrate the victory. Arthur refused all interviews. "There's no victory in watching someone drown in their own reflection," he told Helen. Still, fate had a sense of symmetry. The final blow to Isabella's pride came when one of her former accomplices sold her personal diary to the press. In it, she had written, "He looked at me like I was real. For a moment, I believed I was." Arthur read that line twice. It didn't fill him with anger, only sadness. The same sadness he had carried since Eleanor's passing, the ache of people pretending to be whole. That evening, he walked into the restored ballroom. The chandeliers, once symbols of vanity, now cast a softer, truer light. He found Clara there, arranging stones from the garden into little geometric patterns. "What are you making?" he asked. "A map," she said, "of what's real." Arthur smiled. "Keep drawing, then. The world could use more of that." Outside, the storm that had hovered for months finally cleared. The estate lay in quiet peace, honest and unadorned. The arrogant had fallen, but the humble stood taller than ever. And Arthur Pendleton, once a man blinded by brilliance, had learned that grace shines brightest in silence. Winter came gently that year. Snow dusted the gardens of Pendleton Hall, softening the marble fountains and turning the grand estate into a silent cathedral of light. Inside, the fireplaces glowed, not for display but for warmth, the kind that breathes life into old walls. Arthur sat in the sunroom, a blanket over his knees, a mug of tea steaming beside him. Across from him, Clara worked intently at a small oak desk, sorting through a tray of gemstones under a magnifying lamp. Her tongue stuck out slightly in concentration. "What do you see?" Arthur asked. Clara squinted. "This one's glass pretending to be sapphire. The real one's smaller, but prettier when you don't force it to shine." He smiled. "You've learned faster than I ever did." Clara looked up, grinning. "That's because I had better teachers." Helen entered then, carrying a stack of letters. More invitations, sir. Museums want you to lecture again. Paris, New York, Tokyo. Arthur waved a hand gently. Let them wait. The world has enough men talking. It needs more people seeing. Helen chuckled softly. You've changed, Arthur. No, he said, glancing toward the snow outside. I've just started remembering. On the table beside him lay the photograph of Eleanor, restored and framed anew. Next to it, a new picture had joined. Clara and Helen in the estate gardens, sunlight turning their hair to gold. The two images together seemed to tell one continuous story, of loss, of rescue, of quiet inheritance. A letter arrived that afternoon from one of Arthur's board members. It contained a single line. You've rebuilt your empire, Arthur, but this time it's made of truth. He smiled and set it aside. Empires crumble, but truth endures. As the day dimmed, Clara ran to the window, pressing her hands to the glass. Look, she exclaimed. The light on the snow. It's drinking the sun. Arthur turned to see what she meant. The last rays of sunset had caught the snow at just the right angle, making it glow softly from within. Not shouting, not glittering, drinking light, as Eleanor once described. He felt something rise quietly in his chest. Not triumph, not wealth, but peace. He stood slowly, walking to the window beside Clara. Yes, he said, voice low. That's what real looks like. The girl nodded, her reflection in the glass blending with his. For a long time they stood together, watching the snow fade into silver dusk. Two generations, bound not by blood, but by the same gift. The courage to see clearly in a world addicted to shine. When the last light disappeared beyond the trees, Arthur whispered softly, almost to himself, Eleanor. She would have liked this ending. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, patient, and true.